So it's not about us and how great we are. It's about God and who he is and who Jesus is. And so my hope for all of us today is a couple things. Number one, that we would have that wisdom, that it would have been imparted into us through baptism, through communion, through parents, through people who love us, that we are, in fact, loved and forgiven children of God, and we have a hope for tomorrow. We continue our look at Old Testament characters that we've been doing throughout this year, and we make our way to Solomon. And Solomon is really known for his wisdom. There's other things that he's done, but he's really known for his wisdom. And in thinking through today, I thought that it would be good to look at Solomon's wisdom in light of Father's Day, because I think many fathers might be like me. But when we started talking about having kids, I was a little leery because I didn't know what I would impart to them. I didn't know what knowledge or wisdom I had for a next generation, right? And so as dads or as father figures, we have the yearning, I think, to impart wisdom to the next generation. And that can be hard. But as we look at things, there is a lot of information and wisdom that we can impart, right? Some can be things like jokes from that joke book, like, what did the triangle say to the circle? You're pointless. Ba-doom-tsh. Pastor Bob, that's for you. All right? But then there could be other things as well. Like my dad, one of the things that I learned from him that I would have never known otherwise is what forks to use in a formal dining setting, right? Because we went to some very meals that were very formal because of his job in the Air Force, right? There's these little tidbits that we can impart and pass on to our kids, and that doesn't just go for fathers. That's kind of everyone, right? That we want to impart wisdom. But in order to look at it, we really need to kind of have an understanding of what wisdom is. So I went to my trusty dictionary, right, Merriam-Webster, and here you go. The one thing I think it's missing, though, for wisdom, really, it's that passing it on. I really see wisdom as not just having the knowledge that's stuck up in your head, but that it's something that you are passing on to someone else. And you can have wisdom in a lot of different things, right? You can have wisdom in what it is to teach math, or to paint a wall, or to be an astrophysicist. There's lots of things that you could have knowledge and wisdom that you pass on in. As we look at Solomon, though, not Solomon. We're not there yet. But our daughter, who just graduated 8th grade, one of the things that she did in her speech as a valedictorian was to ask people for wisdom to pass on. And she talked to her fellow students, she talked to her teachers, and she ended her speech with a quote from Fred Rogers. And Fred Rogers in our house is seen as a wise sage, someone who passes wisdom down, not only through his shows and things like Daniel Tiger Today, but also just in who he was. He exuded what it meant to love your neighbor, and that's something we strive to do. And so she ended her speech with a quote from Fred Rogers. It's a different quote, but it reminded me of this one, right? And I really like this quote because it's really about how we see each other. And the end of it really gets me. It's our job to encourage each other to discover the uniqueness and to provide ways of developing its expression. There's so much wisdom in that if we can see the world around us and everyone in their uniqueness and help them live that uniqueness out, I think the world would be a better place, right? Well, Solomon also had different sayings and wisdom that he had. And so I want to take a minute and just look at the life of Solomon. You see, if we go in our Bibles to 1 Kings chapter 1, we begin his journey as king. And it doesn't start out just plain and simple. It starts out with one of his siblings wanting to be king. And so basically going and taking it for himself. But someone notices, a guy named Nathan, who's a prophet, goes and runs to King David and says, "Is this really what you want to happen?" And David says, "No, Solomon's the guy. I know that Solomon is to be our next king." And so he gathers everyone, and Solomon is anointed king. And then as the story goes on, as the narrative goes on, God comes to Solomon and says, "All right, I'll give you anything you ask for. What is it that your heart desires?" And Solomon says, "I want wisdom to be able to govern your kingdom well." Right? Solomon knew he was going to need help in knowing what was right and wrong and where God wanted to take his people. And so he asked for wisdom, and God says, "Well, you know what? You're going to get your wisdom, and on top of that, I'm going to give you all the other things you didn't ask for, the fame and the riches. It's all going to be yours." And so we know that wisdom comes into play in a lot of different ways. But the first thing that happens for Solomon after God comes to him and grants him this wisdom is that there's a dispute over children, right? So a mom comes to the court and says, "This other mom stole my baby." And here's what happened. We were laying there in the middle of the night after our babies were born. She rolled over and killed her baby and then swapped the babies so that I would have the dead one and she would have the live one. And Solomon is overseeing the court, and he hears this. And in his wisdom, he says, "Well, we'll cut the kid in half. And so each of you can have half. And then the dispute is over." Now, the real mom was willing to give up her child so it wouldn't die. And said, no, she can have it. And Solomon noticed that, saw the love for the child, and gave the child to the proper mom, the right mom. Right? And so we see in a very practical way what it is to have this wisdom that God gave him. It's a wisdom that says, here's right and wrong. But it was even more than that, right? Because there's a lot of things that we have that are kind of contributed to Solomon. And there's some books where he goes into deeper knowledge and things. And so he became really famous. Everyone from around the world would come to him. But here's one thing that I think sometimes we can miss in Solomon's wisdom, and it comes from Proverbs, right? So the book of Proverbs is a book of kind of wise sayings that were put together. But here's how it starts. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight. If we jump down a few verses, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Solomon's wisdom took him to a point where he was looking at God, where it really wasn't all about him and all of the things he could do, but it was, "God, what do you want from me?" And as he asked that question, he was blessed to build this temple that was going to be a dwelling place of God, where the Ark of the Covenant could come to rest once and for all, and the Spirit of God could dwell with his people. And it's an amazing thing. And if you read through the first kind of 10 chapters in 1 Kings, you read about not only the temple, but the palace that Solomon built. Because in the wisdom that God gave him, there was skills and other things that were there as well. But we read on in Solomon's story, and we get to 1 Kings 11, and we read that Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, and he fell in love with women of foreign lands, which God had not permitted his people to be in contact with. And because of that, his heart had gone astray. You see, in all of Solomon's wisdom, he started out with pointing to the truth that God, it's all yours. And the wisdom that we have comes from God, but then he started to run after other things. And I think so often this can describe us as well. We get so fixated on the wisdom that we can grab in some area of our life, whether that's in school or a job or dad jokes or becoming an astrophysicist. Now, none of those things are bad in and of themselves, but when we become hyper-focused on any one thing, it becomes an idol in our life. It becomes the thing that really distracts us from everything else. I mean, you probably know people in your life who have run after something, good, bad, or indifferent, that has consumed their life, has fractured relationships, has caused them a lot of grief. And really, at the end of the day, has probably caused a bit of hopelessness, a bit of saying, I don't know what all this is about. I think that's where Jesus' story comes in. You see, Jesus is sitting with some guys who know all of the law. They know all of the stories, Jonah and Solomon, all of it. And they're trying to trip Jesus up. And Jesus comes in and he starts talking about Jonah. That Jonah spent 3 nights and 3 days in the belly of a fish only to go and preach to Nineveh, and the city of Nineveh repents. Right? So Jonah's word is a word of forgiveness, and Nineveh hears that. But there's something about that story that sometimes we forget. That really made Jonah mad. He didn't get it. He listened to God, he did what was said, but then at the end of the day, he didn't get it because he thought Nineveh wasn't good enough. That they had been sidetracked too much as a city to have anything good happen there. So he ends up lamenting on a hill, and God has another story for him. But Jesus says, no, there's something greater than Jonah here. You see, Jonah's message of forgiveness is something that Jesus had been talking about. He had been changing the story about actions that lead to an everlasting life and getting to know God, to a story of love and forgiveness, right? We see it even in how Jesus talks about baptism, right? That it is a word of forgiveness, of love, that bring hope for tomorrow. And Jesus goes on to talk about Solomon's wisdom, right? That there is something greater than Solomon's wisdom here. And when Jesus says that, he's not talking about just here generally about the area or about the region. He is talking about right in front of them. As he says, the Son of Man will have to go into the earth for 3 days and 3 nights and then come out. He's talking about the story of love and forgiveness that is so sacrificial that he gives himself up so that there is a hope for tomorrow. And so as we look at all of the wisdom in the world and all the wisdom that we can gain, it's not bad to know stuff. It's not bad to have a goal and to go after it. But what we see in Solomon is that as you go after one thing with all your might, you can get distracted and go off course. For Solomon, it was women, right? For other people, it's other things. And when that idol comes into your life, if you can't gain perspective and gain that wisdom go back to the wisdom of knowing whose you are and who you are, then you can get lost in the midst of hopelessness. But the wisdom of Jesus is saying you are a loved and forgiven child of God, and that brings a hope for tomorrow. And here's how Martin Luther talks about it. Real wisdom is truly to know oneself and God. That is, that we are miserable and lost sinners. That's how Luther talks about people all the time. Because he wants us to know that it's really not about us. That as we chase after things, we're going to miss the mark. We're going to go after stuff that might become an idol to us. But when that happens, if we can regain perspective and see that there is a greater wisdom than Solomon's here, then we can see Jesus and see what he's done for us. And we can know that God's merciful, not desirous of casting us away, but eager to save us by grace for Christ's sake. So it's not about us and how great we are. It's about God and who he is and who Jesus is. And so my hope for all of us today is a couple things. Number one, that we would have that wisdom, that it would have been imparted into us through baptism, through communion, through parents, through people who love us, that we are, in fact, loved and forgiven children of God, and we have a hope for tomorrow. My other hope is that you have someone in your life that you can impart that knowledge to. That could be a coworker who's struggling. That could be a family member who just needs a word of encouragement. Be any number of people. Because as we look at the world around us, we can see where people have run after idols. We can see where there is hopelessness. And my hope is that you can impart some wisdom in that hopelessness that says, no, there is a place. There is a God. There is Jesus. And as you get connected to him, you can know that you are loved and you are forgiven and you have a hope for tomorrow. And I think that's wisdom to ingest, but also to impart into the lives of the people around you. Amen? As we continue our worship, we continue with giving back to God what he's first given us with our offerings. This is also an opportunity for us if you are visiting or have something you'd like us to know as a church. The Connect cards that are in front of you in the pew or in the chairs or online, and fill one of those out. It's also a time to let us know if you have prayer requests as well. Thank you.